Hello everyone! Today we are continuing this lecture series on the conception of social safety. In brief, I want to remind you about the content of the previous lecture concerning the trinity of matter, information, and measure, which is fundamental for the conception. At a time in the past, the ancient Egyptian Reces gave humanity a false understanding of the surrounding world. Through this false understanding, Reces, nowadays global mafia, have been manipulating the consciousness of every individual in particular, as well as millions of people in general on planet Earth, for several thousands of years. The false understanding of reality, under their wise guidance, has led to a global system crisis. That was the topic of our first lecture. We also mentioned a contraposition of the two worldviews, based on different answers to the question of what is primary, matter or consciousness. I made some concrete examples to demonstrate that materialism and idealism are basically false. It is like arguing about which lies better. In other words, they are both nonsense. In fact, all processes in creation are interdependent, interconditioned, and oscillatory. All these oscillations represent the trinity of matter, information, and measure. Matter changes its content according to the measure of development. Thus, we have discovered the global mistake concerning our perception of the surrounding world, which leads to a false understanding of all processes, including those going on in our society. In today's lecture, we will consider how we got into this trap. We will root out cause-effect relationships. Most importantly, we will look into how it should have been understood, perceived, if considered in connection with all processes ongoing in the universe. The subject of our lecture is the global historical process, as part of the global evolution process of the Earth's biosphere. In other words, what human history is, how mankind developed in the biosystem called Earth, and what the term biosphere represents in a broad meaning. There is a saying, the future sprouts out of the past. And this is in fact so. Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, for instance, once said that the future is the result of the present. This is not correct, because cause and effect relationships are not observed. Kozma Prutkov used to say, look back more often to avoid major mistakes in the future. Therefore, knowing the past through present comprehension, we can speak of the future. Therefore, Gorbachev was not correct saying that the future results from the present. Let's have a look at the history of the development of Rus. All textbooks on our history say that before the adoption of Christianity in the territory of Rus, there were some savage tribes, and what have you. Allegedly, the real history started after the adoption of Christianity by Rus. Until 1917, we had Holy Rus. Then there was a coup d'etat in 1917, and alleged justice was established. As we see, what kind of society we are building now is unclear. By the way, in last year's issue of the magazine Version, issue 1, Putin asked historians, so did the history of our state really start from 988? Or was there something here before that? Historians scratched their heads and said, let us think a bit. Then Putin said that once there was an ancient state named Ladoga. In ancient Ladoga, there was a highly developed culture and writing system. This was revealed on televised excavations in the territory of the ancient Rus. Cyril and Methodius, alleged Slavic enlighteners, diminished our writing system. There was a writing system in Rus before 988. History proves to be a powerful instrument of governance. Next to Rus were the Chinese. There existed Egypt and Europe. In other words, what is the history of humankind? The historical process of Rus was going on alongside those of Egypt, China, and so on. The countries were influencing each other. You won't find reference to this fact anywhere. If you ask our school students, many of them don't know that Pushkin was a contemporary of Karl Marx. This is because our education creates a kaleidoscopic idiocy in people's minds. This is when many facts are provided, but people cannot put these facts together. Pushkin had a very good word formula. It is very profound. There is a lot in it. First, I will tell you the whole phrase, and then we will correlate it to our subject. Pushkin said, "Providence is not algebra. The human mind, as the folk expression goes, is not a prophet but a conjecturer. It sees the general cause of things and can deduce from it profound suppositions, often justified by time, but it cannot foresee chance, that powerful and instantaneous instrument of providence." Note that this phrase starts and ends with the word providence. It is not by chance either. We'll be returning to Pushkin's phrase further on in the lecture. Right now, let us focus on the following. The ability to see a general cause of things allows one to correlate the history of Egypt with the history of Russia, the history of Russia with the history of China, and so on. Those who do not see the general cause of things see only facts, a set of uncorrelated facts, which actually means that there is chaos in those people's heads. Their worldviews are a kaleidoscopic mess. Everything is mixed up in their heads. These people do not see the interconnection between the global historical process and its governance. There is an epilogue in the novel by Lev Tolstoy, War and Peace, where he poses the question, what is the history of humankind? I didn't really expect him to be such a humorist. He goes on to say that usually history is represented to us like this. Once upon a time there were two tsars, Alexander and Napoleon. They lived peacefully. Then they had a quarrel, and Napoleon started a war against Russia. People were killing each other. Then they made a truce and started living peacefully again. Then they had a quarrel again. Napoleon started a war against Russia, made it to Moscow this time, and so on. History books do not tell us that at the same time, thousands of people were raising children, growing wheat, writing books, and so on. To put it another way, our history is a set of facts and events mostly related to states, battles, and the alike. As for cause and effect relationships, you will not find them in history. Therefore, history in the conception is viewed through the prism of the governance of the historical process, not only through historical events, but also as part of the global evolution process. So to say, it is viewed from the beginning of development of life on planet Earth. Why? Because the global historical process is part of the global evolution process. Look, there was only flora on Earth and no mankind. This fact is mostly acknowledged by everyone. Then animals came along, and the whole ecosystem of planet Earth was influencing the development of flora and formation of fauna. Then, with the appearance of people, the historical process started. People began to influence the whole biosystem that they inhabited. And with the appearance of a technosphere, that is when people started meddling with nature, creating different mechanisms, automobiles, nuclear power stations, and so on. The technosphere itself started affecting the whole biosphere. Now, all of this has resulted in the global crisis on planet Earth. Moreover, these days, people do not live in the biosphere anymore. They live in a technosphere. For instance, I saw homeless kids in St. Petersburg that were born during the time of the so-called democracy, who saw nothing in their lives besides pavements and their backyards. They never saw grass, never walked on it barefoot. They didn't know that there were lakes and forests out there. They lived in this concrete jungle. I mean, the technosphere became a habitat. This is unnatural for people. Therefore, we look into history not as a set of uncorrelated facts, but as a process where all the facts are conditioned by cause and effect relationships. We view history as a small fragment of the global evolution process in the biosphere development of planet Earth. So here we go. How can this global evolution process be viewed? There are 2 points of view, materialistic and idealistic. According to materialism, the global evolution process is the process of development of material life forms. Types of life organisms originated on the basis of non-living matter. According to this point of view, people came into existence by accident, out of nowhere, and started evolving. New, more complex species were gradually evolved, adding to the species existing and superseding some other species. The species composition of the biosphere was renewed repeatedly. This is the materialistic viewpoint in general terms. One remark here. Scientific inclination towards materialism, or absence of spirituality. In other words, information as an objective category of being is missing here. Resulted in the situation where the complexity of information content of biological species, the spiritual evolution of the biosphere, fell out of an examination. I mean that purely materialistic science leaves no room for the exploration of the spiritual evolution of the biosphere. It only analyzes and focuses on material carriers. The other point of view, idealistic, doesn't focus on this global evolution process of the biosphere. However, the first chapter of the book of Genesis gives the following order of appearance of life species. First, plants appeared on the earth, then reptiles and birds, then animals, and finally man. This agrees with the scientific data on how different types and classes of life organisms appeared on the earth. One remark from the position of the conception. The following steps are missing. Appearance of bacteria, coelenterate, insects. So to say, this point of view is too primitive. This point of view has absolutely nothing about extinction and the appearance of other species. For example, what happened to the dinosaurs? You will not find anything about this in the Bible. Moving on, the Quran doesn't mention anywhere about the evolution of material forms. But there are certain parts in the Quran that give a description of the global evolution process in the metaphorical fashion. Besides, bear in mind that Muhammad was given revelations despite the fact that he could neither read nor write. He was an illiterate shepherd, Bedouin, who married the widow of Khadijah. She was about 10 years his senior. In the mountain cave Hira, he was given revelations. Before I quote the Quran, you should think about how an illiterate shepherd could generate such things. In particular, Surah 23 says, "We created man from an extract of clay. Then we made him a seed in a secure repository. Then we developed the seed into a clot. Then we developed the clot into a lump. Then we developed the lump into bones. Then we clothed the bones with flesh. Then we produced it into another creature. Most blessed is God, the best of creators. Then, after that, you will die. Then, on the day of resurrection, you will be resurrected." Let's decipher this into the modern language. We created man from an extract of clay. This speaks about the appearance of organic matter out of inorganic. Then we made him a seed in a secure repository. This speaks about the solution of organic matter in its development. Then we developed the clot into a lump. This is the appearance of cells. It distinguishes blood from other organic containing liquids. Then we develop the lump into bones. Then we clothe the bones with flesh. This is about the appearance of multicellular organisms and development of skeletons within them. Then we produced it into another creature. This is about the birth of man from a non-human. We look into the appearance of man in the global evolution process, when there were semi-people before us, but they were not people in its full meaning, and how those semi-people became people. How did this happen? This is what the Quran says about it. Then we produced it into another creature. Everything that Surah 23 tells us about is the description of man's development from conception to death. From biology lessons, we know that an embryo repeats all stages of the evolutionary development of the biosphere. First, an embryo is a tadpole. At the end, we have a little person. Besides that, the Quran invites us to ponder on the arrangement of the world and says that on the whole, humankind is informationally, spiritually connected to the biosphere. One remark here. There are fragments in the Quran that admit repetitive reincarnations, but there are also other fragments that say exactly the opposite. I'd like to say that there is such a religious organization, International Society for Krishna Consciousness. Their view on the evolution process is, there is no evolution. All is given as life forms, that's it. The biosphere is hierarchically unordered. Life forms eternally nomadize in it based on the law of karma. The soul's goal is to break through this wheel of reincarnations, break the karmic chain, samsara wheel. One remark, descendants are blamed for evil deeds of their ancestors. Everyone should ask themselves whether children should be to blame for the deeds of their parents. If we think that every person is an individual, and this individuality is imprinted on the fingers and eyes, there are no identical fingerprints and there are no identical eye corneas, then every person is God's child. So why impose ancestral guilt on God's creature, a new person? There is a lot to think about here. Valentina Lavrova wrote this book, A Key to Life Secrets, where she puts forward a different point of view. Consciousness is an initial soul. Meanwhile, subconsciousness is a repeatedly reincarnated soul, meaning every person has two souls. After death, the souls part, and the original soul sets off to wander. In other words, souls split. So, she means that everything that came before man exists in his subconsciousness, while whatever he does himself exists in his consciousness. That's another point of view that has a right to exist. Thus, the general model of evolution looks something this way. There are many souls, and these souls continuously reincarnate. The memory of past lives in each person is blocked at the level of consciousness. To put it another way, people do not know what was before, in the prior incarnations. There are certain techniques that some people use to penetrate the subconsciousness of other people and allegedly see who they were in their prior lives. You know, I have met such people. All of them usually say that you, for example, were Alexander the Great or someone similar. In other words, it is always some prominent figure. It's never secondary or ordinary people. The memory of prior lives is blocked so that people can learn to live from scratch. From the point of view of certain religions, where there appears a number of souls that have mastered the highest life form among those present in the biosphere, a so-called doomsday is held. The good souls are allowed to pass. The bad souls go down the drain. After that, the bad souls reincarnate into living forms made specially for them. How do materialists treat religions and occult knowledge? They say that all of it is nonsense, absurd, and crazy talk. They discard it, saying, "That's impossible because we think so." They don't see that the informational content of man's behavior differs from the informational content of a mosquito or a monkey due to its higher complexity. The same way as the informational content of a mosquito differs from that of a monkey, and so on. Throughout the global evolution process, the informational content of man's behavior has been in the process of perfecting. Additionally, materialists deny immortality and the indestructibility of soul, measure. What's more, speaking in terms of science, materialists deny objectiveness of spirit, information. That's why we began looking into matter, information, and measure. They state that information and measure do not exist objectively. There exists only matter. The rest is secondary. In other words, they state that matter is primary. There is a famous occultist named Umberto Eco. A lot of his works have become films. Works like The Name of the Rose and The Foucault Pendulum. He also published a book called Five Moral Pieces, which contains his correspondence with one of the Catholic Vatican Church hierarchs. Umberto Eco is a linguist. He explores word formations and everything related to languages. In these essays, he says that there should be some initial words on which everything else, the entire human vocabulary, is then built. In other words, the primary notions should be based on something. Therefore, he set about the task of creating a linguistic formation for those words by means of which everything else in creation can be explained. You should remember that in the first lecture, I told you the story of the time a pharaoh summoned up Jretzis and asked them for the word by means of which one could explain everything in creation. The Jretzis told the pharaoh, "This word is measure." What I mean to say is that Umberto Eco, as well as all science of the West, is looking for what is already set out in the conception of social safety. These words are matter, information, and measure. MIM, matter, information, and measure. They are the initial words by means of which one can explain everything in creation. However, materialists have only one of these initial words, which is matter. All the rest is secondary for them. Therefore, they do not admit that information and measure exist objectively. Then they should answer this question: what happens to information, spirit, and measure, soul, after death? What happens to a spirit and a soul after a person dies? It is a simple question with a deep meaning. Look, man emits oscillations which are determined by the source power, but the modulation of these oscillations is determined by man's measure of understanding and his real nervousness. These oscillations are various. However, there are similar oscillations based on biological characteristics. What makes us different? It is an algorithm of processing incoming information. This is what makes my oscillations different to other people's oscillations. If we have the same thoughts, our measure of understanding and our real nervousness are the same, then our oscillations fall into a resonance and form an egregor, a collective spirit. We will talk about egregors later. The important thing for now is that man emits oscillations. Man dies. What happens to his oscillations, spirit? And what happens to his soul, measure? You know, there is such a phrase, dead starlight, which means the star has already died, but there is still light coming from it. The same thing concerns man. What does man's immortality lay in? His body is dead. His oscillations go to relevant egregors, but his everlasting soul returns to the Creator. Materialism does not contain all of these. By the way, a living person's biofield and the biofield of a dead body differ. Emissions are completely different. If information and measure, as materialist state, disappear, then this point of view breaks all the laws of materialistic science. Because if information and measure do not exist, matter in all its states, solid, liquid, gas, plasma, and physical vacuum, cannot exist either. Now, let's look at the views of quotation dogmatic theology on the evolution of material forms and the evolution of human souls, which occult teachings speak about. They state that it is all Satanism. Then they should answer the question, what is the global evolution process? Let's look at the global evolution process from the standpoint of matter, information, and measure. We know that matter changes its information content according to the measure of development. In the global evolutionary process, there is a development of information, measure, and material forms. Materialistic science deals with material forms. Occult teachings and some religions deal with informational content. Meanwhile, measure is hidden. Here we need to touch upon ancient Egypt, where there was a god named Hermes Trismegistus. Hence the word Hermetism, which means secret knowledge. He holds a staff, the caduceus, which is a symbol of power. Here you can see the caduceus. What is depicted on it? It is a staff with petals. The petals are entwined by two serpents. By the way, snakes crawl only forward and never backward. Therefore, a serpent is a symbol of one-way direction. It also symbolizes the fact that history is irreversible, no matter what one does. There are two serpents. The first one is matter, and the second one is information. In other words, we see two interconditioned evolutionary processes, a development of material and informational forms. The serpent's heads are on the same level, which is important. That means the evolutionary process of matter can neither lag behind nor overtake the informational development. The central axis is the matrix measure, which has the key quality, and on this inseparable trinity, the Creator directs the development of the universe. It is the model of particular development of forms in the trinity: matter, information, and measure. Here is another picture, made by Satanists, where we see a hermaphrodite. This picture symbolizes a new world order. We also see the stuff between his legs. It proves that I didn't make up the stuff. However, as far as you see, Satanists mock such things. Thus, the evolutionary process of Earth's biosphere is one of many evolutionary processes ongoing in the universe. There is the universe. There is a matrix of its possible states. There is a vortex with stepped edges, which inside has a variety of other particular vortexes: the galaxy, the solar system, which includes planet Earth. There is Earth's matrix of possible states, and man in the solar system. As we see, all these mutually hierarchical matrices influence man. Thus, the evolutionary process on Earth is one of many processes ongoing in the universe. For its own life, Earth's biosphere takes energy from the cosmos, in particular from the solar system. Energy is carried to Earth by physical, natural fields. These fields are oscillations. The strength of these fields is subordinate to the cycles of the solar system. These cycles condition a mutual influence between the planets and the Sun. For instance, winter and summer, day and night, and so on. It is all conditioned by the rhythms of the Sun. If we do not take this into consideration, there will be serious consequences. The biosphere and its elements are an interacting oscillatory system. The oscillatory system also interacts with the environment. The Earth is like a spinning top, which spins around. These oscillations our planet emits are influenced by the other planets. People's activity also influences the Earth according to the Trinity. Based on this assumption, we looked into the dependence of the Earth on the informational energetic rhythms of the cosmos. This dependence objectively determines the nature of diverse oscillatory processes in the biosphere and related social systems. It makes a particular conclusion. We need the ancient astrological theories examined through the prism of the Trinity, which are necessary for the safe development of society. A neglect of these processes can lead to serious errors in the development of the human society. Let's look into the main characteristics of the organic biosphere evolutionary process. The most important thing about the evolutionary process is the appearance of the chromosomal apparatus of inheritance. What makes it so important is that it can pass information onto future generations of a biological species. Here you see a slide. Let's look into further details. Here we see a man and a woman who have had a baby. This is one generation. And over here we see other generations. We see that people pass information, genetic inheritance, onto the next generation. Let's make a scheme where we mark every generation as a separate rhythm and mark it with a green wavy line. Every separate line means a separate rhythm. Here comes the new generation, 2000. What will the next generation be like? You should know that all biological species differ from each other. Man differs from the elephant differs from the monkey, and so on. These species differ from each other, and they are genetically closed towards each other. In other words, interspecific hybrids are either impossible or infertile, or their genotype collapses. For instance, a mule is a hybrid of a male donkey and a female horse, and it is infertile. The chromosomal apparatus carries out two functions. It passes genetically determined information from one generation of organisms to the next. When passing it, distortions are extremely rare, which determines genetic stability. Genetics preserves every biological species. The second function is that distortions of genetic information are necessary for the development of a species in the biosphere. Distortions of genetic information are mutations caused by the influence on the chromosomal apparatus of different factors, physical fields, chemical compounds, and so on, which are unnatural for man. And we know about such distortions. They are prevalent around arsenals for nuclear and chemical weaponry. For the same reason, women who live nearby former nuclear test sites give birth to an unusually high number of handicapped newborns. Such distortions we call mutations. Physical fields, electromagnetic, radiation, and so on. Chemical compounds, which are unnatural for a living organism. Some mutations are genetic defects. Such specimens are either unviable or barren or have reduced development potential. They are often referred to as genetically burdened. Let's take a look at this slide. What does it mean? Everybody should learn how to use this diagram. I will now explain its meaning regardless of genetics. This diagram illustrates a normal distribution law. What does this mean? If we take a set of elements and put them under the same exact conditions, then we will see the following. For example, we take a pencil, place it between 2 points of support horizontally, and drop some kind of weight, let's say a brick, onto the pencil. Pencils will react as follows. Some pencils will break right away. Other pencils will bend and return to their original shape, and some pencils will not flex at all. If we take 100 pencils, then the outcomes distribution will be as follows. 35% will break right away, 25% will not flex, and 90% will bend and return to their original shape. Let's say we test people on greed. We will find that from 100 people, 5-6 people are extremely greedy. 5-6 people are extremely generous, willing to give the short of their back. And 90 people are somewhere in between. They will help if needed. The same test on bravery will look as follows. Out of 100 people, 5% will turn out to be brave. 5% will turn out to be cowards. The remaining 90% will turn out to be careful. But there is a big difference between pencils and people. People can change and pencils cannot. People can change under the influence of a culture in different directions. We talked about psyche structures before. So what is happening now? There are more and more people with animal psyche types. Why? Cinema and television are forming zombie and animal psyche types. If we make different movies, then people will be different. By saying that, I want to emphasize that people change, pencils do not. Let's go back to genetics. There is always a genetically stable nucleus in any given population. If we look at the diagram, we can see very good people on the right and very bad ones on the left. In the middle, we see normal people. If we move the curve to the right, then very good will become normal for most people, and very bad may disappear completely. The curve may move in the opposite direction too. As I said before, there is a genetically stable nucleus, which provides a reproduction. Also, there is a genetically burdened periphery, which degrades and degenerates. Ancient Rus had a social stratum of matchmakers, svaha. It is forgotten now. They observed the life in villages or towns, and they selected couples for marriage. If a young person was not acting normally, according to the norm of the society, then he or she would be isolated and not allowed to reproduce. The Russian writer Yefremov wrote the short novel The Andromeda Nebula. He writes that all people were smart, beautiful, and brave. That was the result of genetic selection of people. That means this process is manageable. What is happening in reality today? A genetic disaster within the population leads to the extinction of a genetically stable nucleus. This is Russia today, 2004. Keeping in mind the aforementioned, let's ask the question, where do healthy Russian men die today? They die in inter-ethnic conflicts, in gang fights, of alcohol and so on. This is an example of a genetically stable nucleus being exterminated in a Cold War. If a certain number of people with stable genetics were exterminated, then a recovery would be impossible. That's why the conception of social safety says, abandon harmful habits if you are a patriot of your country. Otherwise, we will end up with a genetic catastrophe. By the way, drinking and smoking girls kill not only themselves, they give birth to children with unstable genetics and poor heredity. Each ongoing generation of them will be more moronic. Don't forget that there are centenary plants. Non-directional variability of mutation. What does it mean? Not every mutation leads to a genetic defect. Some mutations lead to an appearance of peculiarities, and some of those mutations lead to positive peculiarities, thus improving that member of a population. Mutations may be genetically burdensome or may be beneficial for development. What is the mechanism of natural selection? This predetermines the probability of extinction of some and the probability for survival and development of others in a given situation. Every biological species interacts with the biosphere and the universe. The biosphere and the universe put pressure on every biological species. The pattern of that pressure changes due to the subordination of the biosphere to geological processes of the Earth and to energetic rhythms of the cosmos. The frequency of those processes is much lower than the frequency of generational change. This diagram shows us a generation which is under the pressure of a factor. As a result of that pressure, a genotype adapts to a slowly changing environment. But in nature, there are processes with frequencies higher than the frequency of generational change. Let's look at the diagram. We can see the frequency of generational changes. But there is another process with a higher frequency. It is marked in red. If a genotype is not able to adapt to that high frequency factor, that genotype will become extinct. In the introductory lecture, I spoke about the law of time. Here is an example of the law of time. At present, there are many changes around man within a lifetime of one generation. If a person does not process all of it, then he will be destroyed by that factor. In other words, the current informational state dictates that everyone must master a methodology. Many sincerely try to deal with facts, but it is impossible without the methodology. As a consequence, it all ends up with stressful situations. The new informational state, or the law of time as we called it, implies mastery of the methodology in order to deal with new challenges and not be destroyed. If this adjustment doesn't happen, then the whole biosynosis may be changed. Biological species react to environmental pressure in two ways. On one hand, there is a change of development potential, as a genotype adapts in a process of natural selection. On the other hand, there is a behavioral response change of that particular organism itself. Both of these reactions request an informational content. Different species differ by the volume of informational content genetically transferred from generation to generation, by information absorbed by a certain specimen within a lifetime, and a correlation between genetic and non-genetic information. If in the past most human behavior was predetermined by genetics, now most human behavior is being determined by the environment and social sphere in which he or she lives. The number of factors affecting man is increasing, and these factors end up determining man's behavior. During the global evolution process, the appearance of new species was accompanied by the diminishing of genetically transferred information within a total volume of information. For example, the whole volume of behavioral reaction of a shellfish and insects is determined by genetics. But this is not the case for man. For a person, it is non-genetic information for the most part. A volume of non-genetic, social information inhibits genetic information. This is a picture of the information module that determines man's behavior. This egg has two parts. The green part is a genetic component, which is fundamental. The second, white part, is an adaptive part, determined by society. In the past, before the law of time, the genetic part was bigger and the social part was smaller. Today's situation is different. The volume of adaptive social information is much bigger and it puts a lot of pressure on a human being. One of the results of that pressure is that a majority, especially in cities, doesn't even fully realize that they belong to humankind. They do not consider themselves to be part of the whole Earth's biosphere. They think it doesn't concern them. The thought of how their lives depend on the biosphere does not even cross their minds. If there is no air, there is no us. Such simple things don't come to our rulers' heads. Let's talk about simple things like that. A circulation of water in nature is determined not the way we have been taught. Water evaporates, condenses in clouds, drops as a rain into rivers, and so on. How so? Let's look at a human blood circulation. It has two circles, the top circle and the bottom one. So, speaking of a circulation of water, we know we are only being taught about the top circle. Only 15–20% of the water is on top of the earth. The rest of the water is underground. People dispose of waste into rivers and pollute them. They pollute natural filters, the liver of the earth. Making an analogy with a car, when a filter is dirty, a vehicle's engine cuts out. The same may happen with water and the human race. This collapse would be irreversible. But people don't even think about it. Only some scientists warn about it, but rulers brush aside such reports. Such people do not understand their subordinate position to the objective laws of creation. Now, I'd like to say that in addition to the disruption of conscious connections, there are disruptions of unconscious connections, especially in cities. Man's genetic apparatus is 50 times more sensitive than the genetic apparatus of a fruit fly. Thanks to the culture we all live in, man goes against nature, and that is the reason for a global biosphere ecological crisis and other particular global processes. Children face a longer learning time due to a necessity to absorb volumes of information accumulated by humanity. Remember that I gave an example earlier of a proposal to prolong study in schools. It comes from here. Look, a childhood for a cat is short because a cat has to grasp only genetic information. Man needs to absorb not only genetic information. Man needs to learn, in contrast to a cat, whose behavior is determined by instincts. A person accumulates information in inventions, books, and so on. The volume of information is increasing, and study time is extending. Because of that, the correlation of those particular processes is very important. The blue wavy line is the frequency of generational change. This line is under the influence of high-frequency and low-frequency processes. High-frequency processes may change several times within one generation cycle, but low-frequency processes may not even be noticeable to man. If a certain pressing factor arises and a genotype of a population is not able to adapt during the generational change, then the given population perishes. But if a pressing factor arises under the pressure of which a genotype of a population during the generational change cannot make it in time to adapt only for the reason of genetically determined information, then the population may survive due to a diversity of individually determined behavioral non-genetic reactions. It leads to damage reduction. Let's take a look at this situation from the crowd elite model point of view. There is an elite and there is a crowd. The crowd has no knowledge, but the elite does. If the elite is not able to solve the problem of a pressing factor, then the population perishes. Knowledge must be given to all people, increasing the likelihood that someone will detect a pressing factor. We will address this issue in detail when we look into the stability of governance and functioning of supersystems in the sufficiently general theory of governance. Coming back to the diversity of behavioral reactions, the more of these behavioral reactions there are, the better the species' chances of survival. If people do not know what to detect, then they can perish. It is also possible that those with knowledge will miss the factor. Others will not detect the factor either, as they don't have knowledge in this crowd elite system. For example, I have the knowledge and I can detect a present factor, but I fall asleep. You are not asleep, but you cannot detect the factor because you don't have the knowledge. As a result, we all die. But if you had the knowledge, you would manage to react to this factor, even though I was asleep. I think you get the point. That's why we propose that knowledge must be given to everyone. The crowd elite pyramid does not provide survival stability. Now, we will look into man's development. A global ecological niche of the biosphere, the vortex, extended during the global evolution process. Once any species has exhausted its genetically determined potential, then either it pushed out other species and took over their ecological niches, or it inhabited an as yet uninhabited niche by genetically adjusting to it, possibly creating a new species along the way. For example, organisms lived in the sea at first, then moved onto the land. They crawled at first, then birds appeared, and so on. It was a process of mastering a genetically determined potential. Homo sapiens appeared at a certain stage of development. The entire human race, different races, peoples, tribes, and so on, are representatives of Homo sapiens. The development potential of any particular adult organism within any given biological species is genetically determined. But in spite of that, the potential may not open if the environmental conditions are not suitable. What does the term genetically determined potential mean? There is a graphic representation of it in the picture. The green color represents genetics, and the cube represents maximum potential. Oh, here is another example. I think you have heard stories of regular people displaying extraordinary, superhuman abilities when in mortal danger. For example, a mother who lifted a vehicle to save her child, a soldier who saw cracks appear on the surface of a hand grenade, despite that it occurred only for a fraction of a second. I personally had 2 car crashes when I served in the military. The driver was a soldier. We hit a mill wall at 90 kilometers per hour. It happened in an instant. But I saw it like in a slow motion movie. It was stretched over time. What are we talking about here? People have some hidden abilities, unexposed in everyday life, but they exist. There is a city of Vorkuta in Siberia, Russia. Most of the year it is a very cold place. I served in the military there. I ran 7 kilometers every morning to fortify my body against the cold. One winter morning I came across a man who wasn't wearing any winter clothing or gloves. He was wearing only a light jacket and summer pants. I asked him how come he wasn't freezing. He said that once he was driving a tractor through the tundra, and that tractor cut out 50 kilometers from Vorkuta. That's 30 miles. The air temperature that day was minus 50 degrees Celsius. That's around minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit. There was a strong wind, and he was wearing hardly any winter clothes that day. He knew that he could have frozen to death. But he convinced himself that he was warm, and he became warm. He walked all the way to the city without getting frostbite. After that, he never wore winter clothes again. He was never cold. What's more, you can find more examples of this kind on the internet. For example, Wim Hof, also known as the Iceman, from the Netherlands. People have an inner source that opens up in extreme situations. That is the genetically determined potential. I have a question now. Does the culture that we all live in, including education, family, and so on, help a person to master his own potential or not? I think it doesn't. On the contrary, this culture, in fact, oppresses man. This is an anti-human culture. We are creating crutches all around us instead of developing our own potential. For example, what does artificial intelligence mean? It is a creation of a human brain crutch. Don't we want to learn how to use our own brain in the first place? We have a huge potential. You can see a graphic depiction of my words in this picture. But we can reach level X, level Y, and so on. Also, we can master all of our potential if our culture contributes to that process. This process is subordinate to probabilistic predeterminations. There are many accusations. Sociologists are accused of biologization. Biologists are accused of socialization. Both sides demonstrate ignorance. Biologists' ignorance concerns sociology. Sociologists' ignorance concerns biology. Why? They don't see all of it as a holistic picture. Politicians are ignorant in all fields of knowledge. Ask yourselves, do politicians recognize their own ignorance when they invent laws? But those laws influence the culture we all live in. Do people of art, including journalists, consider all that has been discussed here in their work? No. Because these things are not included in the conceptual circle of their understandings. As General Petrov said, many things we do not understand not because our understandings or concepts are weak, but because these things are not included in the conceptual circle of our understandings or concepts. When you explain it all to them, they say in reply that it is nonsense. When you ask them why they have this point of view, they answer, "I just think so. It's my opinion, and that's it." So they can't even explain why they think so. They can have an opinion, but it doesn't automatically mean that their opinion has anything in common with reality. The discussion here is about what part of human is determined by genetics, what part is determined by social information, and what part is created by man himself. Without answering these simple questions, it is impossible to draw the line between biological and social complexes of sciences. What do we have today? Biologists study biology, and sociologists study sociology. They do not view these two sciences interconnectedly. According to the conception of social safety, we state that the entire complex of unconditioned reflexes and instincts is determined by genetics. The ability of formation of conditioned reflexes is determined by genetics. Behavior itself may look like a conditioned reflex, is determined by the environmental influence, social information that circulates within society. Man is distinguished from animal by the genetically determined development of discrete thinking and abstract logical thinking at a certain age, articulated speech, the ability for creative realization of man's intentions through freedom of choice. All of this has become the basis of contemporary culture. The remaining biological species only act according to genetic information embedded in them. Further, a question arises: what is culture? Some would say that the culture is ballet, theaters, literature, museums, arts, also a certain local uniqueness of rooted traditions and customs. Now, let's look what culture is from the point of view of the conception of social safety. A culture is a result of various, non-genetically determined activities of generations of people. But Man's potential to master harmonious living in order to exist in sync with the environment is determined genetically, also thanks to the development of culture. That means that culture is one of many factors of the global evolution process. There is no good or bad culture, so to say, lack of culture. There is a single, multifaceted culture, non-genetic social information, transferred from generation to generation. That information contains side effects, dangerous for people and all humanity. The process of cultural development, that is, the global historical process, is one of the particular processes of the global evolution process of the biosphere. This lecture has come to an end. We have finished looking into the global evolution process. See you next time.